I'm Christopher Rosen, Deputy Editor here at Ankler Media, and this is our first ever virtual composers roundtable with some of the best composers of this year and my favorites as well, who've done so much great work. I'll just introduce all of you here quickly. Daniel Blumberg, composer of The Testament of Ann Lee, an Oscar winner this year for The Brutalist, worked with director Mona Fassvold on The World to Come and The Brutalist, and also obviously on Testament of Ann Lee. We have Bryce Dessner, composer of Train Dreams, who worked with Clint Bentley on Jockey and Sing Sing and an earlier film as well, I know. Daniel Lopatin, composer for Marty Supreme, who's worked with Josh Safdie, that director, on Good Time and Uncut Gems. And John Powell, composer for Wicked for Good, an Oscar nominee this year for Wicked, and also How to Train Your Dragon. And Laura Karpman, composer for Captain America, Brave New World, an Oscar nominee for American Fiction, and has worked on multiple Marvel projects, including The Marvels and Captain America, Brave New World. Of course, these are incredible scores. I guess I wanted to start. All of you have either worked with these filmmakers, like I said, on past projects or within the extended universe of past projects. So I wanted to start, I guess, in those first conversations when you're having those conversations about the music and the score with the filmmakers. What do you want to know to help your process begin and kind of jump forward? I guess, Laura, I'd love to start with you, and then we could go around.
I knew you were going to start with me.
Well, you were last in the alphabetical, so
I just knew it. I felt it in my bones. The MCU is its own sort of beast, and it's a wonderful beast because it's kind of spiritually, musically held by Kevin Feige, who runs the studio. But Kevin is also like a real music fan. He knows scores. He loves scores. He listens to everything, and so he really comes into a situation well-informed and with what he wants. And the thing is I know, John has certainly experienced this, is that, when you work on a franchise, there's always the question that comes up, like, are you going to reference the past films? How are you going to, work with the material that already exists? And it's a tightrope because you want to acknowledge the fine work that's been done in the franchise. But a lot of times the filmmakers, the directors who come on, want to carve their own path, So I think with every single situation like this that I've been in the MCU, every single time, except for Ms. Marvel, which was a brand new IP, you're having to say, okay, so, Pinar wrote this great theme for Captain Marvel, or obviously Alan Silvestri, a great theme for Captain America, as well as Henry Jackman. What do you take from, how do you make this different? Is it going to be completely different? So those are the very first conversations that happen, I think, in a situation like this. And in this particular case, the director, Julius Ona, wanted a different thing. It was a political thriller. It was a conspiracy movie, and he wanted it to have a different feel from the franchise. So that was the mandate that I went ahead and walked with.
John, was that kind of your experience, obviously, with Wicked for Good? Because it's not just, obviously, the adaptation of the musical, and I know you worked with Stephen Schwartz on the songs and the music, but also the second movie that's taking place, it's its own movie. You know what I mean? So, I guess, how did you where did you start in terms of making the music for Wicked for Good then?
I first saw the films together. I saw that they were both basically sort of finished at a very rough manner. So I saw them on a Tuesday and a Thursday at the end of 23 before I started number one. So I kind of already had a plan in my head, at least emotionally, where I was going. And it was always treated as one thing, really, one story. So I had things going in number one, which I was setting up for number two. And there was songs in number two that we were going to use thematically in number one. It was a whole mishmash of ideas at that point in my head. I was just watching the film, watching the story for the first time. I had never seen anything on them. I didn't know the songs or the music or the story at all. So yes, but the main thing is I'm walking into a sort of an absolute sort of minefield. I mean, that's that's what Laura's saying. Is it's a very dangerous situation. You're really going to trip up on not doing enough sometimes and doing too much other times. But I stayed as I deliberately stayed as an outsider so that I could do whatever I was going to do, because there was plenty of people around me who would basically slap me down and tell me if I was destroying something, if I was hurting things. And they did occasionally. Stephen did sometimes. John did more often than anybody else. But the rest of the time, it was basically, you have to respect everybody's love of what they like, but you have to move forward and try and do whatever it is you think you can do for the movie. I was coming at it from a movie point of view, not from a stage point of view.
Right.
And that was my gig.
Right. For Daniel, Bryce, and Daniel, you all obviously worked with these filmmakers many times before. So I guess for Daniel Lopatin, I'll first name and last name you Daniel and Daniel Blumberg. Daniel Lopatin, like working with Josh on Marty Supreme, like what were the first conversations with Josh about the movie, and then like how the music could factor into telling the story?
It was somewhat unusual because Josh usually has a very good sense of what he wants, and to some level he knew even on Marty what he wanted, but there was a different quality to our initial conversations, which were like we're in big trouble. What are we going to do here? Like, this is a big project. I have a big question mark about the score here, because it's a period piece and on some level, but I'm very willing to break the rules of what might be appropriate for a score. But what are we going to do? And all of our conversations tend towards the poetic and the to what John was saying. There's an emotional kind of register that where all of these projects start from. In my experience with Josh, it's like we really have to get to the essence of the film emotionally, philosophically, poetically, and then everything just starts kind of falling into place somewhat magically. But there were big questions about how much adherence we would have towards the time period, how we might subvert it, what I could and couldn't or wouldn't potentially want to do with a large ensemble, an orchestra and choir, which was on the table. What kind of film really is it? Because it's an adventure and it's a comedy and it's a sports film and it's a lot of different interesting things kind of put together. So the initial conversations were largely kind of like, what the hell is this thing that I even made? Which is really fun. It's such a pleasure to not know, after working with one director for a couple of films now, getting really close. It was like, all right, let's jump out without the parachute a little bit, and that was a real pleasure.
Bryce, for you, obviously you've worked with like Clinton, like I said before, on previous films. Did you have like a similar kind of thing, like going into new terrain maybe with Train Dreams, and again similarly, like it's all of, like Daniel Blumberg too, all of these are period movies, like with these perhaps unexpected scores, I guess. So like, how did you kind of like, what were those initial discussions with Clint like for you, Bryce?
Yeah, I mean, it is the fourth film I worked on with Clint Bentley. His writing partner is Greg Quaidar, and they co-write and then they alternate directing. So Sing Sing was the film last year. This film is a small, it's a small story of it's really primarily kind of two or three characters in the woods in the, Pacific Northwest. It is a period film, so it's like it takes place the first half of the 20th century. So there was, the other thing is it's based on a really great book called Train Dreams, which is the book by Dennis Johnson. And so there's a lot in that book in terms of, I often work on movies like this where I get to sort of be part of it really early, which is interesting, which is maybe in a way working on a huge film like a Marvel film or something is also probably that kind of, there's just so much information, as Laura was saying. So in this case, it's like it's coming from the book, and then they were sharing, because we're old friends now and we've, done 4 of these small projects together. They were sharing scripts all along, and I'm kind of one of the first people that sees anything. And in this case, and one thing I can say about the sort of period thing is I'd done a few scores where I was sort of working the way often, I mean, and we could talk about that later maybe, but, sort of to picture in my studio, often with samples and then recording orchestra later. In this case, I really wanted to break that pattern, also because of the kind of intimate period feeling. So I spent a lot of time in analog recording studios, like in places where they'd never had a monitor in the live room, that kind of thing, with old ribbon mics and old, slightly out of tune upright pianos, trying to capture sounds that might have come out of this place. And did a lot of music off picture, actually. So like a sort of suite of themes, like while they were shooting. So there was like 2 recording phases of this film. One was in the kind of research phase, and then a proper kind of bigger orchestral session at the end. So it was interesting, though, to do that sort of double process.
Yeah, that's awesome. I do want to ask you about that later too, and about like just in general the way the music kind of lives beyond in the movies. But Daniel Blumberg, just for you too, in terms of Testament of Van Lee, obviously I know, like I said, you worked with Mona before, and similar kind of like to Greg and Clinton, like where Mona co-wrote The Brutalist, and obviously did her movie The World to Come previously. And this is a musical, which I love. It's such a big swing in terms of the musicality and these shaker hymns and stuff. I guess, like, where did you like start in these conversations with Mona about the music, which is so foundational really to the movie itself?
Yeah, normally, because I normally start from the script, and like before they shoot. But this one I really had to, because there was loads of singing on the set. And yeah, I was sort of trying to find my way into the project with her. It's sort of like a puzzle at the start, because you're trying to find, like, even just remembering what happens in the film is quite difficult until you read it a million times. But this one, they were shooting it in August, and I started on May, in May, and I was like having to do a lot of research on the shakers, and also start preparing the songs for the choreographer, and then for the actors to start learning. So it was all very sort of like all in straight away. Yeah, even just thinking about technically how to do like a musical, because I think Amanda, the main character, was the only one who'd done a musical before. I was meant to phone someone and ask how you're meant to do it, but yeah, like you sort of thinking of if they're singing live, they'll have to have microphones in this place maybe, or having, like, I don't know, speakers hidden for playback. It's this whole load of things all happening at the same time whilst writing music. Yeah, it was pretty bonkers from the start really till the end, doing lots of things at the same time.
So John, for you, obviously you have a musical too here. I mean, is it like how much does that add to the degree of difficulty, I guess, to what you're doing in terms of like similar, like, kind of like making sure everything is ready for this kind of stuff, like Daniel's saying there?
Yeah, I mean, I've done quite a few. Most of them have been animation, though. So it's kind of, you have to do all the songs and stuff in advance, obviously. This was different. I fortunately didn't come on until they sort of shot it all, and they had this brilliant sound guy called Simon Hayes, who's a bit of a genius at capturing vocals on the set. He does this by putting lots of microphones where nobody realizes you can stick a microphone, and also frightens everybody else on set to shut the fuck up all the time. And he's a brilliant at it. So that's why and also they did have incredible singers, in Cynthia and Ariana. So it worked very well, I think, for that. But thankfully, I wasn't actually required on this one to do it. I kind of came on after the whole thing. All of that was done. I really feel for Daniel on that, trying to write the music and deal with all the technical shit.
Yeah, you had to wake up at 6 a.m. every day on the set. That was really weird to get to adjust to, because I work better at night.
Yeah, the trouble with film is they want you to produce music that can only really be done as an artist, and then they want you to do it as if you were working at an accountancy firm.
Well said.
I like that. Look at my filing cabinets.
There you go. That's it.
So that's why I do that. It's like the perfect mix between
Yeah.
bureaucracy and it's amazing.
and creativity. That's so funny.
And
Katie, you were talking.
improvisation.
That's
You were
the fun
talking about.
part, I think, about film music is that, is that it is a system that that you fit into, and I think that the challenge of it and the fun of it is seeing where you can bring magic to something, and then where you don't. Not everything is I suppose you want to bring magic to, but sometimes that's not your job. Sometimes your job is just to get from point A to point B, and then find those places that really animate and elevate when you can have your voice, be primary. That's the balancing act. And so I do think that we function in this kind of, way as filmmakers, as like collaborators, like hair and makeup, like other craftspeople who are on the set, who are working this way. And then we are, artists. We're all, we all do other things. We've all come from a whole variety of backgrounds here, even in this Zoom. And we each bring that unique perspective to whatever project we're working on. That's the cool part. And that's why it's so neat to have even this well-constructed panel with a diversity of musical voices on it. I like it.
Right. Well, thanks. That's good.
No, it's good.
Well, you said something there too in terms of like the music. Bryce, I read another interview that you were talking about this before too, in terms of like doing the composing off picture, and I think you said like it kind of resembled something you would do for a concert hall. And I guess like for all of you, I was thinking this, like I listen to scores like I listen to classical music, and I guess, but like to Laura, your point, like certain parts of it maybe you're trying to get from point A to point B, but also it is great art and you guys are creating great music. So I guess like how do you kind of think about, or do you think about how the music are you trying to do two things at once, like create something that can be standalone as its own kind of, like you could do it in like, a symphony hall like that, and also in the movie, or like how do you kind of balance that kind of creativity, I guess, in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure where I said that. I do, particularly in the case of Train Dreams, because they give me a ton of freedom. And there's very little dialogue in the film. It's almost more like a cinematic poem or something, where there is a lot of space in there for music. So the kind of, I wanted to give the music time to develop. There's something sometimes when you're trying to hit like, and it's an incredible skill to say, say everything you need to say in 40 seconds or in a minute 30. But sometimes the actual kind of composition itself doesn't have enough time to develop. And so in this film, I wanted to give music some sort of just some breathing room and some oxygen. And so that's why I did, but it tends to be like one of my first, primary, bigger films I worked on was The Revenant, which I was working in a team with Sakamoto and Albanotto, and it was in Alejandro Inarritu is like an incredible director. And I think I wrote like, 3 hours of off picture music for the cello, and he's like, I don't think we need cello.
Oh no!
It was good, but it was. I think and in other places, the other thing I can say about that is kind of like the composer ego on a film, sort of to what Daniel was saying, or what Laura was saying, is the beauty of these projects is just these enormous collaborations with so many brilliant people, and so if you sort of bring your whole any kind of baggage with you about needing to, it's really not about that. It's about being humble and finding your role. So I actually love sometimes when it's just like placing one note in a scene, but the scene is magic. I mean, that's as meaningful sometimes as writing some, an 8-minute film cue, which is rare.
Daniel Lopatin, how do you view this part of it?
I agree. It's resonating with me. A lot of the ways in which I communicate with the director ends up like in metaphor, and in the case of Josh, it's often basketball metaphors because we both are big NBA people, and so if you watch the game, then that there's certain kind of teams that aren't necessarily splashy, but they know how to win. And those teams consist of players whose function isn't limited to the position that they claim to play. they simply can read the circumstance and react appropriately. And as a composer, it's a skill to have, because to what Bryce and Laura were saying, there's moments where you're the main attraction and it's your job to, to share your magic, to share your kind of highly individuated kind of voice. And there's other times that might seem more practical or something, but actually when you realize that in its totality, all of these pieces are necessary mechanisms to make the whole, and those lesser assignments, a cue that seems on the surface kind of bland or something, I really enjoy that, because I know that there's a kind of a combustion or a kind of locomotion that needs to happen. I'm being asked to actually move from A to B. That is the thing. That's not a lesser thing. That's movement. That's action. That's energy. And it's just a different kind of cap you wear, that one cue. And hearing Bryce talk about a score where there's room to breathe, oh my God, that's like, I envy it like to no level. I hope I get to work on a film like that, where it kind of has a transcendental quality of time and quiet and stuff like that. Josh is not that director. We are talking about action adventure movies, even when they seem like they're not, or they have a certain kind of excitement and energy. And in the case of Marty Supreme, even audibly, you're dealing with large crowds and cheering, and you're dealing with different modalities of city life, uptown, downtown, out in New Jersey in the sticks. And there's these different kind of audible modalities that also I consider to be part of the fabric of my score, because they simply tell you what's appropriate musically. They tell you where you can slot in, and it's just such a, it's really an endless kind of forging process of figuring out how all these sort of kind of mechanisms fit in. But it's an awareness that you're not the main attraction, and that as a first good step. And then that second step is, what is really going on? What's the soundtrack in the most literal sense of the word? What is actually happening? The voices, the atmosphere, what are all the things that are happening here that can tell me kind of intuitively where I belong? And that's always fun and interesting, no matter how small or big the cue is.
Like you guys talking about before, Daniel Blumberg, you were talking about the research and stuff for the Quaker, for the hymn, the Shaker, excuse me, Quaker, not Quaker, Shaker hymns. But just in terms of the research, I guess, like, and all of you obviously, like, you're talking here, like, you have period movies, like, Laura, you were saying, like, the MCU is so vast, and like, you have to touch it, like, the history of the MCU, you have to probably keep, I mean, like, how much does research help you guys, or not at all? And do you kind of, are you mostly focused on the characters in the story? Like, like, how do you balance, like, how much research is too much research, or the right amount, like, when you're kind of creating music for these kind of projects?
Well, I think you do want to research. I mean, they're sort of, first of all, let me jump back to the previous conversation. We're all sitting here in our studios, which are, say, although Daniel L, I don't know, you're blurred out. I don't know where you are, but
my apartment in Brooklyn.
All right, well, there you go. But we have these private spaces that are really important to, I think, all of us, and that's where we create. And I think for my projects, and I think for many of us, we will write themes and suites and present those to the filmmakers. That's your moment. That's your moment to really express all your ideas. That's your moment, especially in the MCU, to test a theme, see if it can go through the many paces that you'll have to go through. All right. So that, I just wanted to add that. In terms of research, I think depending on the projects, it's actually really important. I mean, and you want to do that research so that you have those musical tools at your fingertips they're really important. And I think, in the case of this Captain America, we wanted to do a mid-century thriller. So, of course, I start listening to Bernard Herrmann and Elmer Bernstein and, Lalo Schifrin and the great composers who really defined what that sound was, I think, for cinema. And that's fun. That's like a great time if you're interested in film music.
I was going to say, like, I had, I feel like all of you, like, I was going to ask about that in terms of, like, researching old film music, too. Like, because, I mean, Daniel Lopatin, like, and your score, I was like, when I first saw it, I was like, oh, Risky Business maybe a little bit. But then I was listening to it back, and I was like, oh, it really is a lot like After Hours, too, like Howard Shore's score. And I was like, are you thinking of these touchstones for these movies? Like, all of you, are you going back, like John, certainly going back to, like, obviously the Wicked Stage musical, but like Wizard of Oz, like, I don't know, and Bryce, like, are you thinking, like, I don't even think it's the right fit, but like Aaron Copland, I was like, what were like any of these kind of, like, how do you guys think about that and, like, kind of build on the shoulders of these giants that came before, I guess? Like, yeah.
I'm with Laura. I mean, I think I love listening to scores, like, generally, even if it's sort of off of the job, because I think, like, I'm not classically trained, so I need to do everything with my ears and by osmosis. So I better be listening to those scores, and I better be listening to them all day, because there's just things you kind of pick up on when there's a language gap that happens through just kind of meditating on pieces of music. And so I listened to a lot of music that had nothing to do with Marty that absolutely impacted my writing, just from a kind of melodic point of view. But kind of what you're saying, Christopher, I think Josh and I have such a kind of a shared and vast language of love of electronic music that kind of runs the gamut, that it's hard to say. Absolutely can tell you a great story sometime, maybe not now, about how Risky Business plays into the film. It's in a really funny way, but we kind of don't plan it that way, but things are just dripping in all of the time. And about halfway through writing the score for Marty Supreme, I had this kind of random memory of Rain Man, which I hadn't seen in like a really long time. And I was like, turned around to Josh and I go, wait a second, does our score sound like Hans Zimmer's score to Rain Man? Which I really like. It's a vague memory from being like maybe 11 years old or something. And we threw it on, and it was such a like weird little, there was some corollary. It was so bizarre. It was like, yeah, actually, like maybe we should say we were really inspired by Rain Man. Like we weren't, but there's these natural kind of linkages that happen, and that score is amazing, and it is a really good corollary, but not on purpose. And also, I think there's something particular to working with Josh where there's a kind of holistic idea of what the score is, but then each cue is like a kind of a mini project and a mini research project and mini reference project, and it runs the gamut.
Yeah, Daniel Blumberg, did you have like, what were you kind of like? A thing I love about Dan Lee's score and the music is like it obviously it feels very appropriate to the period, and you have you're dealing with, like the oldest era of this group here, though I guess the Oz maybe is out of time and place, John. I'm actually not sure if it's the future or the past. I guess it's the past, right? Because the Wizard of Oz, maybe. But anyway, for Daniel Blumberg, I guess for you, like, how do you make it sound like I find your score fascinating because I think it sounds incredibly modern, but also like in keeping with the era and the period. So I guess how did you kind of like, were you inspired by anything, or had you kind of like come up with this sound for how this would sound in this story?
Yeah, no, I think just about before, it's fun. It's interesting hearing everyone talk. I mean, like when I started scoring, because I've never really been into film scores, and I asked Mona and Brady when I first started working with them, should I listen to any? And they were like, definitely don't. And I don't know, I really love films, but I just never really paid attention to, I was always really like into the directors. I never really like came away thinking, oh, who was that actor in the film? It was always just like, who made that film? I want to see another film that they made. So I always go into them thinking that I'm sort of subscribing to the director's like authorship, and like how do I with these guys, they make or like Mona, she wrote her script, so it's like trying to sort of help her find something that's come, you know, she's asked me to do it because maybe I'll help push it in a certain way that she wants me to. But yeah, with the Shaker thing, I had like a starting point of the tradition, like reading about the traditions of their music, and yeah, like starting from the period of when they exist, like in the 1700s, like thinking about what instruments they used, which was that they didn't use instruments. They were singing, and I knew they had bells in their settlements, so I thought that was a good excuse to use bells. And but then the bells became a celeste, which is like known as a bell piano, and then eventually we were playing these. Steve Noble, who played percussion, was playing these like massive church bells, like with sticks and metal mallets and stuff. But yeah, it's just sort of starting out. You start out on an idea and then see what feels appropriate. When you get further into the project, I think your instincts start to align with maybe what the director wants or what the project needs, and then something that might not rationally be the right instrument, but it just feels good. And they're not making like documentaries. I mean, she was making like a drama and like using different processes with the film and the celluloid and effects and everything. So you realize that you can sort of push those boundaries a bit, and then you get to a stage which I think Daniel was talking about, where you just sort of it's just quite instinctive, and you just sort of are in the middle of it, and you feel this makes so much sense. Yeah.
Bryce, I mean, like I was thinking, like hearing Daniel Blumberg there talk about that, I was thinking of the Train Score too, because obviously, like you were saying, it's so much like the environment feels like it's playing so much in terms of the music too. You know what I mean? It goes so well together, I guess. And like, how much did the imagery and the visual, like the poetic nature of the movie, like you were talking about before, how much did that like even push you further with the music and like kind of like try to really tie those together, even maybe beyond than your first impressions of what it would sound like or could sound like?
Yeah, I think it also goes back to this collaboration conversation where, you know, sometimes I think we all have had different experiences. It sounds like sometimes you get brought in late and you have no relationship to the sound designers or the, you know, stage mixer, you know, so there's like these different kind of, you know, places that we're collaborating, but we're not in the same room. This film is different, where I really know Lee Sullivan, who does the sound design, has become a friend. And so we're kind of like in a lot, you know, talking to each other. And, you know, I've had that experience also with Inarritu, because his best friend Martin Hernandez is the sound designer, and so it's kind of like he thinks of music and sound design as one department, which I think makes so much sense. Also, what both Daniels are saying, you know, in the case of this film, again, like whether I was, I mean, I've written a lot of music. Like my orchestral music is very often inspired by nature, like landscape. But there's you know, if I was listening to things, it would be more like, you know, early, like things like, you know, Olivier Messiaen is a French composer, you know, or like first half of the 20th century, who wrote a lot of really beautiful music inspired by landscape. And yeah, I mean, like Sing Sing, which is the score I did with them last year, that one, when I finally saw the film properly mixed and heard what Lee did with the sound design, it was such a beautiful, I could feel the way he was relating to the music, and like, you know, bringing in elements that, again, like I think Daniel, you were talking about that in terms of like these scenes, and there's all this information that you're relating to. So I try to, I guess, you know, in terms of what music can do for a film, it's also kind of finding like a poetic dimension, like what music can say things that you can't do with dialogue, you know. So you're sometimes, and especially again, there's a lot of space in this film, so it's kind of, you know, one example of that is like Felicity's character Gladys, who's, you know, you're never sure if she's in the room or if she's a ghost, or if she's a dream. And so rather than having her kind of floating around like a ghost or something, that the music itself is doing that lifting. So she's kind of very much there and sort of herself and like feet on the ground, but the music kind of takes it, like indicates that there's a bit of you're not quite sure what's going on in those scenes. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, it does. That's really good. I was actually, and it made me think of for John, I guess too, like, I mean, in terms of like thinking of music too, in terms of like working with the characters, I guess like obviously the Broadway musical has music, but you had to start from scratch in terms of the score, and like, you know, you have the songs doing work for the characters, but then like your score, I guess, also gets to kind of bring out more emotions for like for the audience about these characters, I guess. Like, so how did you kind of think of that with like Elphaba and Glinda, and like where they are in this second film from where we left them, and using the music and using the score, I guess, to kind of further the audience's understanding of their like emotional states, I guess.
Yeah, and this one it is very much about Glinda. She's much more simplistic in the first film. This is the one where she has to kind of catch up a bit with Elphaba. So she needed loads of new material, as it were. But one thing I did was just sort of write a tune for her that I could then follow her with. But one of the other things I really needed to do was sort of really bring in much more of the idea of betrayal and lies. So a lot of the themes are kind of sort of all they're particularly poking at certain emotions rather than characters, and that allows you to share themes on different characters at the same time. You know, when betrayal moves from one character to another, you know. It was developing those characters with music, sure, but you know, it's such a complicated one in that particular world. I mean, I've done lots of that before. I try and do the whole leitmotif thing, but never on a character. But this came fully loaded with with millions of people around the world knowing way more about what tune's supposed to go with what characters' eyebrow movements. You know, it was almost hellish to try and sort of comb that apart and see what I could do. I know that was the complicated thing about this score. I mean, I've never done anything. I definitely couldn't have done this score 10 years ago. I think my ego and my technique wouldn't have allowed it. But
that's awesome, Laura. I feel like, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I feel like certainly in terms of like the iconography of the characters, you having a similar thing here with Captain America, and also in terms of like the, I don't know, the emotions. Like I was when John was talking there, I was like, you know, like you were saying like the conspiratorial nature of the movie, and like kind of like this kind of thing where Sam is maybe being, you know, misled in terms of what has happened. Like, how did you kind of make sure that you were thinking about that, and also, yeah, like getting to do like music for a new Captain America for the first time on screen? Obviously, I know like there was the Marvel show with Anthony as Sam and Falcon Winter Soldier, but like to bring a new Captain America to audiences when they had such an affection for Chris Evans' version of the character, which is kind of what's happening in the actual movie. So there's the meta thing about that too. But like, right. Yeah, how did you kind of like work with all of that to make it sound like it does and bring all those emotions forward, I guess?
Well, I mean, first of all, I want to praise John for acknowledging that it takes a setting aside of ego, and it also takes like real compositional technique to figure out your way around these things. And I think particularly with I haven't seen the new Wicked, but I certainly saw the old one. You did a great job. And, you know, there's so much action and so many other elements in those films that you covered beautifully while navigating, you know, a nightmare scenario of like fans. So yes, in the MCU, you got those too. And especially with Captain America, there's a lot of history that goes behind it. And frankly, sometimes some pretty scary malice that comes up, you know. People have an idea about the way these characters should function. And frankly, if they're women or Black people, they get pretty upset. With the Marvels, that was like super scary. I turned off Instagram and Twitter at that point because you just don't want to read that stuff. It's too upsetting. With this one, it was, I mean, I just stopped looking at that stuff, but I originally wanted to do the Silvestri theme and do it in kind of a New Orleans way and update it for Sam. So the first thing I did was go out and record a lot of second line percussion. And then that became sort of the through line in the score. But the filmmakers did not want the Silvestri theme, although I did do a little tiny reference to it that nobody has noticed at the very end of the Brave New World theme, and that he does this great like ascending fourth thing, the da ba ba ba. So that actually is the end of the theme, which now everybody will notice. But I did that as kind of acknowledgement to his mastery and of that thematic world. But no, it's really tough to navigate, and you just have to, approach every project with your own compositional integrity, with your own sense of what the music needs, bringing in, in my case, many, many years of experience as a film composer. And I have to tell you, I thank my lucky stars that I've gotten a chance to work on these massive films, because I didn't have that for most of my career. Most of my career was in, small independent films and documentaries. And then in the last 5 to 6 years, I've been embraced in a different kind of way and given this opportunity to work in these massive landscapes, which, I mean, it's a thrill of a lifetime, and it's something that I treasure. And just to work on films of this scale, it's so different. It's so different from like an American fiction that everything was done in here and it was handmade. These are big ass movies that, we had 12 French horns, you record with the massive orchestra, you go to Abbey Road, it's really fun. And it's old fashioned scoring in a way, it's old fashioned movie making, but I'm all in, I love it. And it's like I said, it's a privilege to be working on them. It's a privilege to be a woman, working on these kinds of projects that have been traditionally, the domains of males in every way, composers, filmmakers, and all of that. So I appreciate Marvel being open-minded and bringing, me in on these projects that it takes a little bit of guts to do it, so. I don't know. I didn't want to say that, but there it was. I said it.
I'm glad you did though, because I also think like in terms of the music, like I was listening to your score, and like I was like, it's so good, and it's like if it was, like it's just it's a good score. You know what I mean? Just beyond like it being Marvel, whatever it is, and I think like your work with it is really special. I just think it's a good score. You said something there too about like the fans, and obviously I'm not going to say like the fans of like Clint Bentley movies or Josh Samuels or Mona Festival movies are in that same regard. That said, obviously for you guys obviously and Wicked obviously too with the Marvel, I would say, but you're working with your filmmakers, and like they're clearly fans of the work that you guys have all done previously. And I guess like, do you think about that again, probably not nearly at the same scale as something like a Marvel or Wicked, but do you think about like how like to tweak the expectations of the Safdie brothers or the Safdie fans, right? Those kind of things, or like, like Clint Bentley, obviously, and like we're saying like Clint and Greg, or even and Mona and Brady, because like those movies are really, there is like a strong following of people who really love these filmmakers. So I guess like, how do you try to like subvert the expectations, or do you not have to worry about that because the projects are different in each time out, I guess? Daniel, Lopatin, you want to go, or Bryce, or whoever?
Sure.
Doesn't matter. Yeah.
I think, it's an interesting question. I think when you cross that bridge of a second, third, fourth project with a collaborator, you just naturally want to try different things or push yourself first and foremost. And the audience is going to have to suffer the consequences. And so we're entertaining our own whimsy and our own idea of a good time, I guess, first and foremost, trusting that, hopefully we have something that's worth kind of following us down whatever rabbit hole we're going to go. In this case, we felt that we had sort of done something And then we had even done it again and refined it. And so for this third go, we were really searching for something new. And we know that it's going to sound like the kind of scores that we come up with, the same way it's going to feel like the kind of film that Josh will make. His films have a certain kind of feeling and a certain kind of voice that carries through all of his work, big or small. But on this one, what was really fascinating and what I got really attached to was a couple things. And this actually speaks to what Bryce was saying earlier about sort of the locking into the kind of formal aspects of what's happening in the film on a kind of unspoken level. There's the game of table tennis itself, in the case of Marty Supreme. And the first time I listened to the film, and I mean that, I closed my eyes and I listened to the film, I'm just listening to the sport itself, and it occurs to me almost like lightning fast that the buoyancy and the quickness and the energy and the speed of the game is exactly mirrored by the way Marty Mauser is and talks and behaves. And it's about persuasion and speed and being mercurial and the lightness of the ball and the quickness of the sport. Mallets. It just occurred that was going to be the best choice I could make there, and that was never going to be something I would have occurred to me otherwise. So now it's like, well, are we thinking about actual vibraphones and are we looking at the period and kind of adhering to it? This is where it got really interesting for us, because the film kind of deals kind of almost existentially with a young man who has a dream of himself in the future, perhaps, that the world around him can't truly understand or isn't buying into or won't entertain. And so this is when the magic of allegory or a metaphor really comes into play for me, because using a kind of a neoclassical palette establishes a sort of unspoken quality of the old world, of limits, of older people, of people kind of saying you should go be a shoe salesman and not be this and not be that. And also of great wealth and power, which is also he kind of comes up against in the film. That's the sort of neoclassical aspect idiomatically in the film. And then on the other side, you have his dream, this young man's dream. He's a kid in his 20s, in the early 50s. We assume he might make it to the early 80s, the mid 80s, in which he might look back and think about how he got here. And so that kernel of the idea of, Tears for Fears was actually in the script. So it all sort of started coming together. There's the labyrinth of the old world he has to navigate, as represented by this kind of classical music. And I'm very specific about neoclassical, because that's as close as I can come to classical. And the new world that he's envisioning for himself as a kind of the music of new wave of the 80s. And so when they kind of enter in conversation with each other, that's the magic of the film, and that's sort of why it works, even though on paper it sounds completely bizarre. But it actually works because it really is keyed into the heart of the character of the main character's story.
It sounds like it reminds me, because we have Daniel Blumberg here. Obviously, I was thinking too, and you're talking there about like in the Brutal. I know it's a different movie, but in the Brutalist, at the end of the Brutalist, when they go to the epilogue, and you have when he's in the Venice. I guess it's like, what is he at the Venice Film Festival right at the end or wherever it is, and you have like the theme has been like turned into like Giorgio Moroder almost, like kind of, which I always thought was like so cool in the Brutalist. And then Bryce, I was thinking of Train Dreams too. Obviously, you're jumping different. I thought that I was visually and just in the movie, I loved. Not necessarily spoiler, but when we kind of jump around in like Robert's timeline, right? And like we go into the future, does that kind of like similarly play into your mind, like in terms of like what Daniel was saying there about like the music and like kind of flexing beyond the character, I guess? Like, how did you kind of think of that?
Yeah, I think it's not as specifically sort of, I think that's fascinating. No, I haven't seen the film yet because it just came out, right, Daniel? But I'm excited.
Dude, yeah.
All of you guys, all these new films. I'm so
These
excited.
are all great films. I'm just
we'll get you. We got to get you all to a
fan
screening.
of all of your work, so it's really exciting. I mean, in the case of Robert, which is Joel Edgerton's like the main character of Train Dreams, the film plays with time in kind of a labyrinth-like way. So it begins and ends in the same place, which is it's not spoiling it, but he's like his sort of final scenes of his life, and. I think for me, it's more stylistically. There's a sort of sense of American string music, like folk music, fiddle and acoustic guitar, and kind of really like more. And that's some of that sort of more rustic sounding stuff that I recorded in that way. And then there's this much bigger orchestral palette that is maybe for film scores that I've worked on. Weirdly, like two things I would say. The film could take electronics. It's a period film. It's set in the woods, but something about it, like there's a few cues which are like a prophet, and just they're like a synthesizer or something. And it was almost like, oh, this is going to work. And the Clint really took to having a kind of modern, some moments like that. That were also, I think, just even harmonically, what you can do sort of spectrally with overtones and things with the synth. I hear that a lot in your work, Daniel, like, knowing your music is onion tricks, and then what you do in a score, it's super, super interesting the way you play with that. I'm not an electronic musician, but I'm always sort of like hopefully, kind of to dipping my toe in. So there's sounds like that. And then there's these much more dissonant orchestral cues, which for like I was talking about the concert hall thing, I do a lot of work with orchestras where I'm pushing, because it's like it's the only thing happening on stage is the piece or whatever, and you can really push it. Oftentimes, film directors will knee jerk at that, where they will love a really simple idea, and that's incredibly hard to write. A beautiful, simple idea. It's not easy to write a good melody. Sometimes complexity for complexity's sake, it just immediately goes down the drain. In this film, weirdly, Clint kept being like, I think you can go further. You can push it. And so there's these moments where there's these sort of long harmonic sequences, which I was really excited about exploring.
I had fun on this one, actually using electronics. And Bryce, you're so right. Like there's a way, especially when you're dealing with samples and demoing for a client, there's a way that electronics can move that it's hard to do with the samples. But then I wound up orchestrating the electronics as well. So it wound up being this really cool combination. It's the first time I've ever done it, really, of electronics and orchestra, but thinking about, okay, so what's in the orchestra? How can I manipulate the orchestra to actually emulate the electronic sound, and working backwards like that and creating this kind of resultant instrument that became something new. And it was cool. It was, and I know you come from concert music, I grew up that way as well. And it's neat to kind of go backwards in a way and to continue to play with those boundaries and let the electronics take you to another place orchestrally and vice versa. I think that's a bit of experimenting that we can do under the nose of the filmmakers without anybody really noticing, and get away with some murder there,
It's really great. I wish we could keep talking, but we do have to wrap this up. But I had so much fun chatting with you all about these movies. And like Daniel, they're all great movies. So if you, I know you haven't, and you should all see your own movies, and everyone watching should see these movies. I think they're truly great. And this has been such a great year for scores, in my opinion. And I feel like these are really some of the best ones out there. I'll just do another I'll reintroduce everyone as we say goodbye. But Daniel Blumberg, obviously composer of The Testament of Ann Lee; Bryce Dessner, composer of Train Dreams; Daniel Lopatin, composer for Marty Supreme; John Powell, composer of Wicked for Good; and Laura Karpman, composer for Captain America: Brave New World. All these are great scores. Thank you all so much for being part of this. It was really fun chatting with you.
Thank you, Christopher. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.